Thanks for clicking on Wayne.com for this week's edition of Inside the Zone as we return with the man, the myth, the Kenny, Justin Kenny, joining us from Optimum Performance Sports, backed by popular demand. They wanted Kenny, we gave it to them. You'd be surprised how many people asked me if we were still doing this year. So,
well, I'm sure they were hoping for a different person other than me. But
oh, I thought you other than me.
Oh no, you're a given.
My wife was like, you need to get off that show. Let's talk a little bit about where we are, before we get into the conferences, where we are at this point as opposed to where we were at this point last year. I remember talking to you at this point, and I was always saying, if we got past week 4 last week, if we got to week 4 last week,
right, I
thought we'd be done with pandemic stuff by now. I think everybody thought we would, but now that everybody has gone through a season with the pandemic, we went all the way to state. Hopefully things are trending in the right direction. How do you approach the season if you're a head coach or a program or a player knowing that, man, I didn't think we'd have to be dealing with this anymore?
Yeah, I think everybody was ready to look ahead and say, we don't have to deal with this, like you said, anymore. And now here we're talking Delta variant, and we're already seeing, McConaughey was closed for the week, and we're seeing other signs of teams not playing their scrimmages.
Belmont didn't practice last week.
Yeah, so, we're not out of the woods yet. So I feel like we're still probably not in a position like we were last year, where it was really going to be a big impact almost weekly. But I think we're still going to see games here or there that are going to go away because of what's going on still.
And we start in the SAC this year, or today I should say, with what is as wide open an SAC to me as we've seen in a while. And those years seem to be the most fun years to cover because you never know what's going to happen on a given Friday night. When you look at the big picture of the SAC right now, who do you see as the teams in contention to win a victory bell and bring it back home this year?
When you look at it, I think it's the usual suspects up top. I think, and we can say usual suspects, but last year it wasn't the case for Snyder. But I feel like Snyder is that team at the top of the conference right now. That defensive unit, will be the best unit in the league on that side of the football. At all 3 levels, they have playmakers. And then offensively, you expect Luke Hoppert to improve upon last year. Starting as a sophomore, really thrown into the deep end in a lot of ways. Threw 2 touchdowns, 7 interceptions. But I think really started to learn the nuances of the Snyder offense. We expect him to take a step forward. Tyrese Brown in the backfield ran for 1,000 yards last year for an offense that really had no identity throughout most of the season. And they went young. They really sacrificed at some point last year. Midway through, they said, all right, it's a youth movement now. We're going to play all these guys, and I think it pays off this year. You look at the other contenders. What 2-time champion have we overlooked quite like Homestead, right?
I was just going to say that. If you're Homestead, you're like, hey, all we've done is
we're over here,
2 consecutive championships, and we've done it different ways.
Yeah.
What more can we do?
What else can we do to get some respect? Homestead, I think, is the top contender to Snyder. But you look, having to get Peyton Slavin in there, new quarterback, I don't feel like that's an issue. We always see Homestead just replaced. But offensive line, replacing so much up front on both sides. They're a little smaller than they were last year. They're considerably less experienced than they were a year ago. So when you look at how they match up with defenses with the ferocity of Snyder, I think that's where it goes Panthers' way. So I think Homestead's in that conversation. You look at Bishop DeWanger. What do they do at quarterback? I don't know if they've settled on it. I don't know if they're going to by committee. What are they going to do over there? So I think there's a lot of questions with Bishop DeWanger. Carroll, is that defense any better? They could score against anybody, but also give up a lot of points. So in terms of breaking down the contenders and who has the least amount of questions, I'm putting Snyder and Homestead atop.
Well, I wanted to ask about Carroll because Carroll's going to be our game of the week against Bishop Lewis, and also wanted to follow up on Bishop Lewis because we don't see a 2A team compete for an SAC championship very frequently, or a 3A team in like a Concordia. But this is a team that obviously, a special unit, they went down, almost won the 2A state title last year. You'd like a little more depth on the line. You talked to Kyle Lindsay or his dad before that. And he was like, well, it's always going to come down to our line in the SAC because we're a small school playing these bigger schools, and line depth and health is very important. But when you talk about Carroll and Lures, this game starting off in week 1, how much will we learn about both of those teams through week 1? Because that Carroll defense, as you mentioned, we know Jeff Becker can sling it, and then Lures is obviously returning with high hopes for the season.
I think it's a great barometer for both teams because you're putting that Carroll defense that was much maligned a year ago against arguably the best set of skill position players in the SAC coming up on Friday night. And then conversely, can Bishop Luers play against a 6A team for 4 quarters and not wear down, particularly in the trenches? Don't go very deep there. Can they make enough plays against a Carroll team that can rotate guys in, for 48 minutes? So I think that's an open question for Bishop Luers when we look at the bigger picture with the Knights and saying, can they compete for an SAC championship? They're going to have to be able to compete and contend with the teams like Carroll and Dwenger and Snyder and those teams in Homestead that can really, wholesale substitutions, because Bishop Luers, while they're deeper than they have been, still lack in depth. So I think you're going to find out a lot about both teams on Friday.
And I really want to see what Bishop Dwenger has to offer, because you're talking about they graduated a lot of guys, but they have huge numbers on the roster this year. And they're just, it seems like even if they don't, Rocco Sioka's a stud, but you don't pick out a lot of studs on their team. The guys up front, the Fia Cables and the Wigginton's and those guys that we've seen in the past. But they're just going to out-Dwenger some teams. You know what I mean? Like they're just going to replace guys and function so well within their scheme, not beat themselves, that they're going to be tough no matter what they've got on the football field because of the discipline that they have.
Right, and we're going to go back in November and go, okay, this guy we should have talked about at the beginning of the year, this guy, but just because they're replacing players doesn't mean that they're, having a significant drop in talent there. Bishop Dwenger just reloads, right? It's just with a bunch of guys that we don't really know, other than guys like Jack Tipman and Rocco Sioka and guys you mentioned. So I feel like just because it's an unknown at Bishop Dwenger doesn't mean that they're going to go 3-6 or anything. I just feel like maybe they have a little bit more in terms of inexperience and questions than some of these other contenders.
This is a year where if we lose the Dwenger roster on a Friday night, we can just call them Tipman and be good. They've had a lot of Tipmans in the past, but KJ, they have so many Tipmans this year when you go out of practice. It's insane. One of the sexy teams we talked about last year was Northside. Deuce Taylor at the quarterback position, all the skill guys that they have. Skill guys are back. Brayshawn Bassett's in at quarterback. But to me, the one thing we didn't talk about much last year was how vital the offensive line was, because we saw in Deuce's junior year, when he was running for his life, he didn't have the opportunity to pick apart a defense. In watching the scrimmage against Luers on Friday, that concerned me as well, although the number one of the 7 deadly sins is never put too much into a scrimmage. So I'll leave that at there. But Northside obviously has a new coach, and the expectations are higher than they have been in the past as they build this program. What can we expect from them? And Northrop also is in a similar boat in that they've started to build the monster, if you will, and we're starting to see it pay off on Fridays.
2 intriguing football teams, and we forgot week 1 last year because we put so much attention on Northside, pummeling Snyder, that Northrop knocked off the SAC champions last year in week 1. Yeah, Homestead was missing some players due to COVID, but Northrop being able to beat that team and hand them their only loss of the conference season was very impressive. So I think Northrop can continue to rise. You mentioned Northside, and they lost some bodies up front, and can they replace those guys? So sophomore Jordan King is going to be very important to come in, a big player, physically and figuratively and being huge for them up front in a lot of different facets. Brayshawn Bassett is a phenomenal athlete, but I don't think he's reached a point yet where he's a phenomenal quarterback. Deuce Taylor was both, right? And how many times was Deuce able to escape pressure, extend plays, and get the ball downfield more than anybody else we've seen in the last couple of years in the SAC? Brayshawn Bassett needs to protect the football, get the ball to the players in space to make plays. Can he do that? And then defensively, a lot of questions there as well. So new coach, new regime, new quarterback. I just have a tough time seeing Northside being able to take that step forward from the previous seasons just because of the personnel changes. But I think Northrop could be that team that at the end of the year that we're looking maybe could be a 5-4, could knock off a couple teams that we think they shouldn't, because 2 last 2 years, most wins in almost 20 years in back-to-back seasons for the Bruins. I feel like they have a lot of momentum. And I think finally you look at a Northrop team that I think can match up with ones, with a fair amount of teams, most of the teams in the SAC, even the 2s, you get down late in the 3s and 4s, that's where you see the precipitous drop for Northrop. But I feel like they're slowly but surely really closing that gap to be a consistent competitor.
Concordia, we've got a new head coach there, but a familiar name in Mike Eschbach. Southside has a new head coach, and we haven't talked about the Wayne Generals, who are in the second year of the Sherwood-Haydock era. Not the best time to take over a program during the pandemic. I feel like Wayne has, as Coach Haydock mentioned this, very cyclical at Wayne. Every few years you get the groups of Darius Alexanders and Craig Youngs. It's not every year. Some schools have it every year, but there will be a time, Sherwood Haydock was saying, in his tenure at Wayne, well, they will have those athletes and he'll be able to put it together. And I feel like they're starting to put it together a little bit right now. Those three teams, what do you see as some of the keys with Concordia, Southside, and Wayne as they look to ascend from, let's say, the bottom half of the SAC to the top?
Well, I think you take Wayne first off, and they got some athletes out there. I think Sean Collins is one of the more underrated players in the area. I mean, the kid ran for almost a first down per play last year, and it was a team with very limited offensive options a year ago. So I think Sean is one of the phenomenal athletes that nobody's really talking about in the area. After that, there's still a lack of depth there, but they have some athletes. So you mentioned it similar to with Coach Haydock talking about those classes that you're going to get at Wayne, and you need to put it together. Similar to Woodland, when he was at Woodland and was able to put it together a couple years and get down to the state championship game. So Wayne's going to have those athletes that come in and maybe that magical class. He just needs to find a way to consistently get those kids, not just at Wayne, but also get them out on the field. Year two, I think we see an added amount of competitiveness out of Wayne, and I think it'll go a long way towards continually to build that program. I think Concordia, they don't completely hit the reset button, but they got a lot to replace, and Coach Mike Ashbach's going to bring his system in there, so I think it's a year of transition for Concordia. And then Southside, they really just need to get kids out. You know, talking to some players out there, they feel like they're a little bit more confident than the last couple of years heading into the season. Does that translate into, you know, some wins, or at least some competitive games on Friday nights? I feel like, man, Southside would really benefit from a couple non-conference weeks to get a couple close games or even victories on their side to really try to build some momentum.
That's a good point, because you take a look at at Southside, the Lattimores and the Hapners and, you know, maybe English. Those are guys that could play a lot of places.
Yeah.
But just the numbers when you go out to that practice, man, you just wish they had some more numbers. But Guy Lee said, you know, number one thing is recruit the hallways, and that is what they're going to be doing in year one.